an original story narrated exclusively for Love Written in Silence. Rain hammered the thatch roof of Clara Ashford's cottage the night Edmund Hale returned to her life, soaked through, bleeding from a gash above his temple. His 5-year-old son pressed against his chest. 11 years had passed since he spoke 4 sentences that destroyed her world. 4 sentences she had repeated to herself during every sleepless night until they stopped cutting. Now he stood at her threshold, barely able to stand, asking for help she had every right to refuse. She looked at the child first, gray eyes wide with terror, unhurt but shaking, then at the blood mixing with rain on the man's face. Her hands, stained with yarrow from a day of healing, reached not for the door to close it, but for the boy to lift him to safety. The needle she would thread to stitch Edmund's wound was already in her mind, steady and sharp, because Clara Ashford had learned long ago that survival meant doing what was necessary, even when your heart was screaming to let the door stay closed. The pounding came again, violent enough to rattle the latch. Clara set down the mortar where she had been grinding dried comfrey root and crossed the single room of her cottage in 4 strides. The candle on the table guttered as she passed, throwing shadows against walls lined with drying herbs. Rain hammered the thatch overhead with a sound like stones thrown against wood. The storm had been building since sunset, turning the road to Hartmere into a river of mud and darkness. She lifted the latch and pulled the door open against the wind. A man stood on the threshold, water streaming from his coat, his face pale in the candlelight that spilled from behind her. One arm was wrapped around a small boy pressed against his chest. The child's face was buried in the man's shoulder, small hands gripping wet wool. Blood ran from a gash above his left temple, mixing with rain, dripping from his jaw. Clara's breath stopped. She knew him before her mind permitted his name. The shape of his shoulders, the line of his mouth. 11 years had carved new lines beside his eyes and hollowed the space beneath his cheekbones, but the recognition was immediate and absolute. Edmund Hale, Viscount Ashwick, the man who had told her at 18 that he did not love her, had never loved her, that she had been nothing more than a country amusement. Clara, his voice was hoarse. He swayed, steadied himself against the doorframe. The horse threw me on the road. My son, William, he is not hurt. I could not. There was nowhere else. He stopped. His eyes were unfocused. The boy in his arms lifted his head, and Clara saw the child's face for the first time. Gray eyes, dark hair plastered to his forehead, no visible injury, but shaking so hard his teeth chattered. She looked at Edmund, at the blood, at the boy. Then she stepped aside. Bring him to the fire. Sit at the table. Do not move. Edmund stumbled across the threshold. Water and blood pooled on the stone floor as he crossed to the hearth. Clara shut the door against the storm and followed. She lifted William from Edmund's arms. The boy came willingly, too frightened to resist, and wrapped him in the heavy wool blanket from the back of her chair. She settled him on the hearthstone where the fire's warmth would reach him fastest. You are safe, she said quietly. You are not hurt. Stay here. William nodded, eyes locked on her face. Clara turned to Edmund. He had collapsed into the chair by the table, one hand pressed to his temple, blood seeping between his fingers. She lit a second candle from the first and set it on the table. Then she crossed to the shelf where she kept her medical supplies and took down a clean cloth, a bowl, the needle case, and the bottle of distilled spirits Mrs. Fenton had taught her to make for cleaning wounds. She poured water from the kettle into the bowl and carried it to the table. Edmund watched her approach with an expression she could not read and refused to interpret. She set the bowl down, dipped the cloth, and wrung it out. Move your hand. He lowered his hand. The gash was deep, running from his temple to just above his eyebrow. Clean-edged, the kind of wound that came from striking stone. Blood welled and ran down the side of his face. Clara pressed the cloth against the wound. Edmund flinched. She ignored it. She cleaned the blood from his face with strokes that were efficient and impersonal, the same motions she had used 100 times on 100 patients. The fact that this man had once kissed her beneath the oak tree on the Hale estate, that she had once believed he would be her husband, was irrelevant. He was bleeding. She was a healer. The rest could wait. She rinsed the cloth, wrung it again, and pressed it firmly against the gash to slow the bleeding. Edmund's jaw tightened. She held the cloth in place and counted silently to 30. When she lifted it, the bleeding had slowed but not stopped. This needs stitching. Clara, I do not speak to me. Sit still. She threaded the needle by candlelight, her hands steady. She had stitched her first wound under Mrs. Fenton's supervision 6 years ago. A farmer's son who had caught his arm on a scythe blade. Her hands had shaken then. They did not shake now. She poured spirits over the needle, over the thread, over her own hands. Then she leaned close and began. The needle pierced skin. Edmund inhaled sharply, but did not move. Clara worked in silence, each stitch small and even, pulling the edges of the wound together with the precision Mrs. Fenton had drilled into her until it became instinct. She was close enough to feel the heat of his skin, close enough to see the individual threads of silver in the dark hair at his temple. His breath was shallow and controlled. Hers was steady. She tied off the final stitch and cut the thread. She cleaned the wound again and pressed a folded cloth against it. Hold this. Edmund lifted his hand and held the cloth in place. Their fingers brushed. Clara pulled back and turned to the hearth. William was still sitting where she had left him, wrapped in the blanket, watching everything with wide gray eyes. Are you hungry? She asked. The boy nodded. Clara took bread from the box on the shelf, cut 2 thick slices, and spread them with butter and honey. She handed one to William and set the other on the table beside Edmund. Then she poured milk from the jug into 2 cups and brought them to the fire. William took the cup with both hands and drank. Color was returning to his face. Clara crouched beside him and ran her hands over his arms, his legs, checking for injuries she might have missed. Nothing. He was cold and frightened, but unhurt. What is your name? She asked. William. His voice was small. I am Clara. You are safe here. The storm will pass. Do you understand? He nodded. Good. She stood and returned to the table. Edmund had not touched the bread. He was watching her with an expression that made her want to throw him back into the rain. You need to drink water. You need to eat. You will stay awake for at least 2 hours so I can observe you for signs of confusion or worsening injury. If you show signs of either, I will wake you throughout the night. Do you understand? Yes. Do not thank me. Do not apologize. Do not speak unless I ask you a question. Edmund's mouth tightened, but he nodded. Clara sat in the chair opposite him and folded her hands on the table. The candle burned between them. Rain hammered the roof. William finished his bread and curled up on the hearthstone, the blanket pulled to his chin, his eyes drifting closed. She looked at Edmund, at the stitches above his temple, at the face she had tried for 11 years to forget. Why were you on the road to Hartmere? We were traveling south to London. William has had recurring fevers. I was taking him to a physician, and the storm caught you. 3 miles north. The road flooded. The horse panicked and threw me. I hit a stone marker. William was not hurt, but I could not. He stopped. His hand tightened on the cloth pressed to his temple. I remembered your father's cottage was near Hartmere. I did not know if you... My father is dead. This cottage belonged to Mrs. Fenton, the apothecary's widow. She trained me and left it to me when she died 2 years ago. Edmund stared at her. You are a healer. Yes. How long? Do not ask me questions about my life. You forfeited that right 11 years ago. Silence. The fire crackled. William's breathing had deepened into sleep. Clara stood. I am going to examine your pupils. Look at me. Edmund looked up. She leaned close, holding the candle to one side, and studied his eyes. The pupils were equal, responsive. No sign of confusion. She set the candle down. You can sleep in 2 hours. Not before. She turned away and began cleaning the blood from the floor. Edmund watched her in silence. When the floor was clean, she hung the cloth to dry and checked the level of water in the kettle. She added wood to the fire. She checked William, who was deeply asleep, his face peaceful. Then she sat in her chair and picked up the mortar and pestle she had abandoned when the pounding began. She ground the comfrey root into powder and did not look at the man sitting across from her. The storm continued through the night. Clara woke Edmund every 2 hours to check his responses. Each time, he answered her questions clearly and without confusion. Each time, she let him return to sleep without speaking beyond what was medically necessary. William did not wake. He slept curled on the hearthstone, like a child who had learned to find rest wherever safety appeared. By dawn, the rain had lessened to a steady drizzle. Clara stood at the window and looked out at the gray morning. The road would be impassable for at least another day. The stream that ran past the cottage had overflowed its banks and spread across the low meadow. No one would be traveling today. She turned. Edmund was awake, sitting up in the chair where she had made him sleep. The cloth had fallen from his temple during the night. The stitches were clean, no sign of infection. William was still asleep. "How do you feel?" she asked. "My head aches. Otherwise I am well. That is normal. The ache will lessen over the next few days." She crossed to the shelf and took down a small jar. "This is willow bark powder. Mix a pinch in water and drink it twice a day for the pain. Do not take more than that. Thank you. You cannot travel today. The road is flooded." Edmund looked toward the window. "I see. You will stay here until I determine it is safe for you to travel. A head injury requires observation. If you leave too soon and collapse on the road, you will die, and your son will be alone. I will not have that on my conscience." "I understand." Clara handed him the jar. Their fingers did not touch. She turned to the hearth and began preparing breakfast. Oats, milk, honey, the same meal she made every morning. The fact that she was now making it for 3 instead of 1 changed nothing. William woke as she was setting bowls on the table. He sat up, blinking, and looked around the cottage with the cautious confusion of a child waking in an unfamiliar place. Then his eyes found Edmund, and relief flooded his face. "Papa, I am here. We are safe." William stood and crossed to the table. Clara set a bowl of porridge in front of him, and another in front of Edmund. She took her own bowl and sat. They ate in silence. William finished first and looked at Clara with an expression of tentative curiosity. "What are those?" He pointed to the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. "Lavender, rosemary, thyme, yarrow. I use them to make medicines." "What is yarrow?" "A plant that stops bleeding." "Would you like to see?" William nodded. Clara rose and took down one of the bundles. She brought it to the table and broke off a sprig. The dried flowers crumbled between her fingers, releasing their sharp, bitter scent. "Crush this between your hands." William took the sprig and crushed it carefully. He lifted his hands to his nose and inhaled. His face scrunched. "It smells strange. Most medicines do, but it works. I used it on your father's wound last night." William looked at Edmund, then back at Clara. "Are you a doctor? A healer?" "I help people when they are hurt or sick, like the physician in London." "Similar, but I do not bleed people or charge 40 guineas. William's eyes widened. 40 guineas is a great deal of money." "It is." Edmund set down his spoon. "William, finish your porridge." William obeyed. Clara returned the yarrow to its hook and began clearing the table. She could feel Edmund watching her, but she did not meet his eyes. She washed the bowls and set them to dry. Then she took her cloak from the peg by the door. "I have patients to see in the village. You will stay here. Do not leave the cottage. If your head begins to ache worse, or if you feel confused or nauseated, sit down immediately. William, you will stay with your father. Do you understand?" "Yes, miss." Clara pulled the cloak around her shoulders and lifted the latch. She stepped out into the gray morning and closed the door behind her. The rain had stopped, but the sky was heavy with clouds, and the air smelled of wet earth and rising water. She walked the muddy lane toward the village, her boots sinking with each step, and tried to quiet the storm that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the man sitting at her table. She returned 3 hours later to find Edmund asleep in the chair and William sitting on the floor by the hearth, staring into the fire. The boy looked up when she entered. "Papa said his head hurt. I made him lie down. Did I do right?" "You did exactly right." Clara crossed to Edmund and checked his pulse. Steady. His breathing was even. The stitches were clean. She let him sleep. She hung her cloak and set her bag on the shelf. Then she sat on the floor beside William. "Are you frightened?" she asked. William nodded. "Of what?" "Papa was bleeding. I could not make it stop. I thought he was going to die. He is not going to die. The wound is healing well. In a few days, it will be only a scar." "Are you certain?" "I am certain." William looked at her with gray eyes that were far too serious for a 5-year-old. "My mother died. Clara's chest tightened. I am sorry. She was sick for a long time. The physicians could not help her. Papa said sometimes people cannot be helped. That is true. But your father's injury is not like that. He will recover. William nodded slowly. Then he looked at the bundles of herbs hanging above them. Will you teach me the names of the plants? If you like. I would like that. Clara pointed to the nearest bundle. That is rosemary. It helps with headaches and digestion. Smell it. She broke off a sprig and handed it to him. William crushed it between his palms and inhaled. A small smile appeared on his face. It smells like the kitchen at home. Cooks use it in food, but it is also medicine. What is that one? Lavender. It helps people sleep and calms the mind. She took down the lavender and let him crush the dried flowers between his hands. His smile widened. For the first time since he had arrived at her door, he looked like a child instead of a small, frightened adult. Edmund woke an hour later. He sat up slowly, wincing, and looked around the cottage. His eyes found Clara and William sitting by the fire, surrounded by sprigs of herbs. William was naming each one, his voice bright with concentration. Rosemary, lavender, thyme, yarrow. Well done, Clara said. William beamed. Edmund stared at them with an expression Clara refused to interpret. She stood and crossed to the table. How is your head? Better. The ache has lessened. Good. Drink water. Eat if you are hungry. She handed him the jar of willow bark powder. Edmund took it without a word. Clara returned to the fire and continued teaching William the names of the plants that had become the architecture of her life. The second day passed in careful silence. The rain returned in the afternoon, heavy and unrelenting. Clara treated 2 patients who came to the door, a child with croup and a woman with a sprained wrist. William watched everything, his eyes wide, his questions careful and thoughtful. Edmund sat in the chair by the window and observed Clara work with an intensity that made her want to order him outside into the rain. By evening, the storm had worsened. Clara made soup from dried peas and the last of the bacon. They ate together at the table, and afterward, William fell asleep by the fire again. Clara checked Edmund's wound. It was healing cleanly. No infection, no fever. You can travel tomorrow if the rain stops, she said. Thank you. Do not thank me. I did what any healer would do. Clara, I told you not to speak to me beyond what is necessary. That has not changed. Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and said nothing more. Clara banked the fire and lay down on her narrow bed in the corner of the room. She did not sleep. She listened to the rain and the sound of Edmund's breathing and tried to remember why she had built these walls and whether they were strong enough to survive 2 more days. The storm cleared on the 3rd morning. Clara woke to pale sunlight slanting through the window and the sound of an axe striking wood. She sat up and looked around the cottage. William was still asleep by the fire. Edmund was gone. She pulled on her boots and stepped outside. Edmund stood by the woodpile behind the cottage, splitting logs with steady, methodical strokes. He had rolled up his sleeves, and his hair was damp with sweat. The pile of split wood beside him was twice the size it had been yesterday. Clara crossed the yard. What are you doing? Edmund set down the axe. You were low on firewood. I did not ask you to do this. I know. You should not be doing heavy labor. You had a head injury 3 days ago. My head is fine. I needed to be useful. Clara stared at him. The roads are clear. You can leave today. I know. Then why are you splitting wood? Edmund did not answer. He picked up the axe and split another log. Clara watched him for a moment, then turned and walked to the kitchen garden on the south side of the cottage. De garden was overgrown. She had been too busy with patients over the past week to weed, and the rain had encouraged everything to grow wild. She knelt in the dirt and began pulling weeds from around the rosemary plants. Her hands moved quickly, automatically. She did not think about the man splitting wood 20 feet away. She did not think about the boy sleeping in her cottage, or the fact that neither of them had left yet. She pulled a stubborn root and tossed it onto the pile of weeds beside her. Then she heard footsteps and looked up. Edmund stood at the edge of the garden, the axe still in his hand. May I help? You do not know how to weed a garden. Then teach me. Clara stared at him. His face was calm, but there was something in his eyes, something she did not want to name, that made her want to send him away and pull him closer in the same breath. She pointed to the bed of thyme. Pull anything that is not thyme. Do not damage the roots. Edmund set down the axe and knelt in the dirt. He began pulling weeds with the careful clumsiness of someone who had never worked in a garden. Clara watched for a moment, then returned to her own work. They worked in silence. The sun climbed higher. Birds called from the hedgerow. After 20 minutes, Edmund pulled up a thyme plant along with the weed wrapped around it. Clara crossed to him and took the plant from his hand. Not like that. You have to feel for the root. If you pull without checking, you destroy what you are trying to save. She knelt beside him. Give me your hand. Edmund held out his hand. Clara took his wrist and guided his fingers into the dirt, showing him how to trace the root of the weed away from the roots of the thyme. Her thumb pressed against the inside of his wrist, just above the pulse point. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong. Feel that. The weed's root goes left. The thyme goes down. Separate them before you pull. She released his wrist and sat back. Edmund stared at his hand for a moment, then carefully pulled the weed free. The thyme remained intact. Like that, Clara said. Like that. They returned to their work. Clara's heart was beating too fast, and she hated that she noticed. She hated that his presence in her garden felt both like an invasion and like something she had been waiting for without knowing it. William appeared in the doorway of the cottage, rubbing his eyes. He saw them in the garden and walked across the yard, still wrapped in the blanket. What are you doing? Weeding, Clara said. Would you like to help? William nodded and sat on the doorstep. Clara handed him a sprig of rosemary to hold. He turned it over in his hands, studying the needle-like leaves, and then looked up at her. Will you teach me more plants today, if you like? William smiled. It was the second time Clara had seen him smile, and it was easier than the first. Something in her chest loosened, and she looked away before the feeling could take root. They worked until midday. Then Clara made bread and cheese and brought it outside. They ate sitting on the doorstep, the three of them in a row, looking out at the garden and the meadow beyond. William asked questions about every plant he could see. Clara answered each one. Edmund said nothing, but she could feel him watching her. After the meal, William fell asleep on the doorstep, his head resting against Edmund's arm. Clara stood and began gathering the weeds she had pulled. Edmund stood as well. Clara, she did not turn. Do not. The roads are clear. I can leave. I need to tell you something first. There is nothing you need to tell me. There is. Clara turned. Edmund was standing 3 feet away, his face shadowed, his hands clenched at his sides. I did not come here by accident. I knew your father's cottage was near Hartmere. When the horse threw me, I could have gone to the inn. It was closer, but I came here. Why? Because I have been trying for 2 years to find the courage to see you. And the storm gave me an excuse to be a coward. One more time. Clara's hands tightened on the bundle of weeds. You have no right, I know. But I am asking you to listen anyway. No, Clara, you told me you did not love me. You told me I was a country amusement. You married someone else within a month. You do not get to arrive at my door 11 years later and ask me to listen. I lied. The words fell between them like stones. Clara went still. What? I lied. Every word I said to you that day was a lie. Clara stared at him. The garden blurred at the edges. The ground beneath her feet felt unsteady. Why? Edmund looked at William, still asleep on the doorstep, then back at Clara. Because my father was dying, and the estate was collapsing under debts. The solicitor, Mr. Graves, told me I had 2 choices. Marry you and watch the estate fall within 2 years, or marry Lady Margaret Beckford and save every tenant family. My father begged me to choose Margaret. He said if I loved you, I should not make you a pauper's wife in a ruined house. Clara's breath came shallow. So you decided for me. Graves said if I told you the truth, you would insist on staying. He said the only way to make you leave was to make you believe I did not want you. So I said what he told me to say. You told me you did not love me. I lied. You told me I was nothing. I lied. And then you married her. Yes. Clara dropped the bundle of weeds. Her hands were shaking. You took away my choice. You decided I was too weak to bear the truth, so you destroyed me instead. I was 19. I was a coward. I have been a coward every day since. You were not protecting me. You were protecting yourself from having to see me suffer. Edmund flinched. Yes, Clara's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. 11 years. Every wall she had built. Every night she had repeated his words until they stopped cutting. Every patient she had treated. Every skill she had learned. Every brick of the life she had constructed. All of it built on a lie. Get out. Clara, get out of my house. Take your son and leave. Please, you do not get to do this. You do not get to arrive here and tear down everything I built, because you finally found the courage to tell the truth. I do not care that you lied. I care that you decided for me. You took away my choice because you were afraid of what I would choose. You are right. I know I am right. Now leave. Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and lifted William into his arms. The boy woke, blinking in confusion. Papa, we are leaving. But now. Edmund carried William across the garden and around the cottage toward the road. Clara stood in the dirt and watched them go. She did not move. She did not call after them. She stood in the garden she had planted and felt every wall she had built crack open. When they were gone, she sat on the doorstep where William had been sleeping. The stone was still warm. She pressed her palms flat against it and let herself cry for the first time in 11 years. Not for the girl who had been abandoned, for the woman who had been built on a lie, and who now had to decide whether to remain. 5 days passed. Clara did not see Edmund. She heard from Mrs. Dawson at the village, well, that the Viscount and his son were staying at the inn. She heard from Mr. Fletcher that the Viscount had been seen walking the lanes around Hartmere every morning. She heard from young Tom Bailey that the Viscount had spent an hour sitting by Mrs. Fenton's grave in the churchyard. She did not ask why. She did not go to the inn. She treated her patients, brewed her tinctures, and tended her garden. At night, she lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to understand who she was if the woman built on Edmund's lie did not exist. On the 5th day, rain returned. Not the violent storm that had brought Edmund to her door, but a steady, gray rain that soaked the earth and turned the lane to mud. Clara stood at the window and watched it fall. She thought about the girl she had been at 18. The girl who had believed Edmund when he said he loved her. The girl who had planned a future that included him. That girl had died the day he spoke those 4 sentences. Clara had buried her and built someone new. But if the sentences were lies, then the girl had been killed for nothing. And the woman Clara had become, strong, self-sufficient, needing no one, was a monument to a fiction. She put on her cloak and stepped out into the rain. The inn was a quarter-mile down the lane. By the time Clara reached it, her cloak was soaked through and her hair was plastered to her face. She did not care. She climbed the steps and knocked on the door. Edmund opened it. He stared at her, water dripping from her cloak onto the threshold. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You are soaked," he said finally. "I walked here in the rain on purpose." "Why?" "You arrived at my door in a storm and asked for help. I am arriving at yours." Edmund stepped back. "Come inside." Clara entered. The inn's common room was empty except for William, who sat by the fire reading a book. He looked up when Clara entered, and his face lit with a smile that made her chest ache. "Miss Clara." "Hello, William." Edmund closed the door and turned to face her. They stood in the center of the room, dripping water onto the floor, and Clara tried to find the words for what she had come to say. "I need you to understand what you are asking for," she said finally. "I am not the girl you left. I am a healer. I deliver children and set bones and sit with the dying. My hands are stained with yarrow. I will not leave Hartmere. 40 families depend on me. I am not asking you to leave." "Then what are you asking?" "I am asking whether the woman who built everything I failed to build would consider letting me stay, not as a viscount, as a man who is learning very late that choosing is not the same as arriving in a storm with no other option." Clara looked at him, at the stitches above his temple, nearly healed, at the hands that had learned to pull weeds without damaging roots, at the man who had spent 5 days walking her lanes instead of leaving. "Your estate, your title." "My estate has a steward. My title is a word. My life has been a performance for 11 years. The only real thing in it is a boy who smiled for the first time in 2 years because a woman with yarrow-stained hands showed him how to crush lavender." Silence. Rain drummed against the windows. William watched them with wide, hopeful eyes. "William needs a proper healer. Clara said quietly. Not London physicians who bleed him and charge 40 guineas. Is that a yes? It is a diagnosis. Come inside. You are getting wet. So are you. I walked here in the rain on purpose. You are standing in it, out of stubbornness. Edmund's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile. He gestured toward the fire. Will you sit? Clara crossed to the hearth and sat in the chair opposite William. Edmund followed. He sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and they stared into the fire in silence. William looked between them. Are you staying, Miss Clara? For a little while. Good. William returned to his book, satisfied. Edmund turned to look at her. I do not expect forgiveness. I know. I do not expect you to forget what I did. I will not. But I am asking whether you will let me prove that I am capable of staying when the road is clear and the storm has passed. Clara met his eyes. Why now? Why not a year ago? Why not 5 years ago? Because Margaret told me to. Before she died, she said William deserved a father who was not performing. She told me to find the one I should have chosen. Not for my sake, for his. Clara looked at William, bent over his book, his face peaceful. She sounds like she was a good woman. She was better than I deserved. Most women are. Edmund's laugh was quiet and rough. Yes, Clara stood. I need to go. I have patients to see tomorrow. Edmund stood as well. Let me walk you back. You do not need to. I know. I want to. They walked back to the cottage in silence, the rain falling steadily around them. When they reached her door, Clara turned to face him. If you stay, it will not be easy. This village is small. People talk. My reputation depends on trust. If they believe I have compromised myself, I lose everything. Then I will make certain they do not believe that. How? By being visible, by being present, by proving that I am here not to take, but to stay. Clara studied his face. You will chop wood and weed gardens and carry heavy cases to patients' homes. Yes, you will knock on my door instead of walking in, as though you have a right to be here. Yes, and you will understand that I am choosing this, not because I need you, but because I am deciding not to live behind walls anymore. Edmund's gaze held hers with quiet intensity. Yes, Clara reached for the latch. Then you may call on me tomorrow, in daylight, with William, and we will see. We will see. She opened the door and stepped inside. Edmund remained on the threshold, rain dripping from his coat. She looked at him one more time, then closed the door. She stood in the darkness of her cottage and pressed her hand to the place over her heart, where something had shifted, not healed, not whole, but no longer built on a lie. 3 weeks later, evening fell soft and gray over Hartmere. Clara stood at her stove, stirring soup, when she heard a knock at the door. She smiled and crossed the room. She opened the door to find Edmund standing on the threshold, dry this time, wearing a plain coat that had seen 3 weeks of garden work. He carried a basket of vegetables, carrots and onions, and turnips from the garden he had been tending every morning. You knocked, Clara said. It is your door. You have been here every day for 3 weeks, and I will knock every day until you tell me to stop. Clara took the basket. Their fingers brushed on the wicker handle. She held his hand there for 3 seconds, feeling the rough calluses that had not been there when he arrived. The soup is almost ready. William is reading by the fire. If you stand in the doorway much longer, he will eat your portion. Edmund stepped inside. Clara carried the basket to the table. Behind her, she heard William's delighted greeting and Edmund's quiet response. She set the basket down and turned. Edmund stood by the fire, one hand resting on William's shoulder. He looked at Clara across the small room, and she saw in his face the same question he had been asking for 3 weeks. Not with words, with presence, with the steady, unglamorous work of staying. She crossed to him, slowly, deliberately. His eyes widened. When she was close enough to feel his breath, she stopped. You have been very patient. I am learning. Good. She reached up and took his face in both hands. His skin was warm beneath her palms. She looked at him for a long moment, at the scar above his temple where she had stitched him back together, at the eyes that had learned to ask instead of assume, and then she kissed him, slowly, deliberately. The first truly brave thing she had done in 11 years. Edmund's hands came up to grip her wrists, holding on as though she might disappear. She pulled back just enough to speak. You taste like rain. You taste like someone who has been waiting. I have been. So have I. I simply refuse to admit it. She kissed him again. And this time he kissed her back with a desperation that had nothing to do with passion and everything to do with relief. When they finally broke apart, William was staring at them with wide eyes. "Does this mean Miss Clara is staying?" he asked. Edmund looked at Clara. She looked back at him and felt the last wall crack open. "Yes," she said, "I am staying, and so is your father." William's smile was bright enough to light the room. They ate dinner together at the small table. Afterward, William fell asleep by the fire, and Clara and Edmund sat side by side in the chairs by the hearth. He took her hand. She let him. "I do not know how to do this," he said quietly. "Neither do I, but I want to learn. Then we will learn together." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. She leaned her head against his shoulder and felt the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Outside, the rain began again, soft and constant. Inside, the fire burned warm. The door stood open. It was always open now. Autumn came to Hartmere in shades of gold and rust. The mornings grew cold, and the first frost touched the kitchen garden. Clara walked the village lane toward Mrs. Hadley's cottage, her herb bag over her shoulder, her breath misting in the air. Footsteps fell into rhythm beside her. She looked up to find Edmund walking at her side, carrying the heavier case. William ran ahead, naming plants along the hedgerow the way Clara had taught him. "Rosemary, hawthorn, blackthorn, yarrow." "Well done," Clara called. William beamed and ran further ahead. Edmund glanced at her. "Mrs. Hadley's daughter is due next month." "Yes, I will need to check on her twice a week until the birth. I will have the cart ready. You do not need to." "I know, I want to." Clara looked at him, at the man who had learned to knock on her door, to weed her garden, to carry her cases, without being asked. At the man who had stayed. She leaned against his shoulder for half a stride. He adjusted his pace to match hers. They walked together through the village, visible and chosen, heading toward someone who needed her. Behind them, the door to her cottage stood open, morning light spilling across the threshold. The same door, the same threshold. Everything had changed, and the rain, when it came again, was only rain.